Well, welcome everybody to Spartan Theology. We got a pretty exciting debate today that we've been working on getting going for a little while. We tried to do it about, I guess it was a little over it was almost 2 weeks ago, but we finally got schedules worked out. So we're really excited for this one. So, like I said, thanks for everybody coming out. I see JB and John and Steven Steen in the chat and John Buck. So thank you guys for coming out. And if you're watching this either live or later, if you could, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It definitely helps keep things going here and show me that you guys are enjoying the content I'm putting out. So yeah, I'll bring in my debaters here in a second, but I guess I'll lay out the debate tonight is going to be what better explains reality. So each debater is going to be presenting his worldview essentially and arguing for that. So it's not necessarily like, is young earth creationism the only interpretation of the Bible or anything like that? It's more, how do we take what we see in reality and whose model better explains it? And we're going to be both gentlemen are Christians, so we're expecting to have a friendly debate, but it may get a little bit heated because these are passionate topics. So with that, I'll bring in my debaters and we'll introduce everybody. Boom. Yeah, so we got Travis and Seth here. Ooh, I got you guys backwards. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, and I'll fix up the cameras a little bit while you're doing that. But I'll throw it over to Travis, kind of let everybody know who you are and just a little bit about yourself so we can kind of get an idea, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Travis. I've been a Christian for about 3 years and 2 months now. I came to faith through apologetics, mainly through Reasons to Believe in Hugh Ross. And one thing I did want to make clear, during this debate, that to the audience, if you are a young earth creationist and you see it as essential to the faith and you see it as a coherent model of reality, then please go with that. I don't even want to change your mind. I won't be offended. My interest in the debate is more that modern science and faith and Christianity are not in conflict with each other, and in fact complement each other. So that's more of my interest in it.
Awesome, awesome. So yeah, thank you for introducing yourself. We'll throw it over to, I guess we'll give Seth, he's going to do his opening statement first, so I'll give you a little bit extra time if you want to introduce yourself beforehand, and then you can just jump right into your opening statement if that works for you.
That works for me.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, my name is Seth Bloomsburg. I've been a Christian since I was about 4 years old, and I've never wandered from the faith, but I got excessively interested in apologetics, mostly through the ministry of my pastor, Doug Wilson, who's in Moscow, Idaho. I've listened to and witnessed some of his debates, and that's basically what got me interested in it. He convinced me that it's important for all Christians to study, and so I started studying it. And so I will jump into my opening statement.
Yeah, and actually, just before you get started, I just wanted to...
So the question before us tonight is whether young earth creationism or old earth creationism is biblically consistent. I'm taking the young earth creationist viewpoint. Young earth creationism is typically defined as the belief that the earth is approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years old. I believe that all evidence, both from the text of the Bible and from science, ultimately point to a 6,000-year-old earth. Let's look at Genesis. It's necessary to establish the literary genre of a text before interpreting it. Jesus himself teaches the necessity of this when he would preface some of his statements by saying, "Scripture says," or "It is written," as opposed to speaking in parables, where he would say, "The kingdom is like leaven," or "the man who sowed seeds." The Apostle Peter warns us that stories about Jesus are not cleverly devised fables, 2 Peter 1:16. We also need to know that the Bible uses figures of speech to make the statements. At different points, Isaiah refers to the four corners of the earth in 11:12, but also refers to the earth as a circle in chapter 40, verse 22. And yet Jesus insists that Scripture cannot be broken, John 10:35. The earth is obviously not literally a circle, nor does it literally have four corners, but both statements from Scripture are infallible in what they actually assert. So what genre is Genesis? It's quite clear that Genesis is supposed to be taken as actual literal history. The genealogical structure of Genesis shows that Moses was not dealing with myths or imaginary persons, but real historical flesh and blood people. The style of Genesis indicates it is very much prose, not poetry. Hebrew poetry has a characteristic style with three elements: parallelism, terseness, and ellipsis. Parallelism presents two lines of thought that correspond. Terseness presents a poetic statement by means of a noticeable economy of words, and ellipsis involves the omission of a word when it would normally be expected. These characteristics are all absent from Genesis 1. One other significant feature of the language of Genesis is the wal consecutive. It's known as the narrative's tense and functions in the sense of then X. Kenneth Gentry notes that this high frequency of the occurrence of other wal consecutive verbs is completely consistent with the other narrative passages in the book of Genesis. Wal consecutives are characteristics of historical genre. Wal consecutives show up abundantly in Genesis 1. To be sure, there are poetical sections in the Pentateuch, such as the Song of Moses in Exodus 15 or the Curse in Genesis 3. But none of this indicates these events are ahistorical. But Moses avoids typical poetic structuring devices in Genesis 1, which includes the creation account. Later biblical writers refer to the creation week, or the creation narrative, Adam and Eve themselves, or all of Genesis, as historical. Peter refers to the flood as history, 2 Peter 3:5, specifically saying that people deliberately overlook the historical fact of the flood. Both Matthew in 19:4 and Mark in 10:6 refer to the creation of Adam and Eve as historical. Paul says Adam was created as a living soul, 1 Corinthians 15:45. Paul says Adam was created before Eve, 1 Corinthians 11:8 and 1 Timothy 2:13. Paul says sin came into the world through one man, Romans 5:12. He refers to the temptation and sin of Eve, 2 Corinthians 11:3, 1 Timothy 2:14. The genealogy of Adam, Seth, and Enoch are referred to as historical in Luke 3:38 and Jude 14. The author of Hebrews refers to Cain and Abel as historical, and the genealogy in 1 Chronicles refers to Adam as historical. So it's pretty clear at this point that Genesis, and chapter 1 specifically, is in the genre of history. The creation week does not use any poetic elements, which means it's prose. But even if it was poetic, that wouldn't establish its ahistoricity. Now to the creation week itself. The Hebrew word for day is yom. Yom always means a normal 24-hour day, or sunrise to sundown, when it is used as a singular noun and not found in a compound grammatical construction. This is the exact form used in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. Frequently, the prophets use the construction the day of the Lord, which does not refer to a 24-hour day. But this is because of compound grammatical construction. This construction is the only exception to the rule, and this form is not found in Genesis 1. The creation days are explicitly qualified with evening and morning language. If there is any ambiguity about what yom meant, then this removes it. The words for evening and morning, eber and boker, occur 30 other times in the OT and always denote a normal 24-hour day. Genesis also adds a numerical prefix to each day, indicating its sequential structure. This is further proof that the 6 days are literal because every time yom appears in sequentially numbered, uninterrupted series, it always refers to 24-hour days. We see this in Exodus 12:15 through 16, 24:16, Leviticus 23:39, and Numbers 7:12 through 36. Moses does this 157 times, and this occurs 357 times outside the Pentateuch in the Old Testament. In every single one of these instances, a numerical adjective accompanying yom indicates a literal 24-hour day. Exodus 20:11 and 31:15 through 17 refers to the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest. These passages refer to the 6 days of creation in the plural as yamim. This expression is used 858 times in the Old Testament and always refers to 24-hour days, never to ages of time. There is a specific Hebrew word, olam, that refers to long lengths of time, and Moses did not use that form in Genesis 1. So as far as the evidence from the text of Scripture, that's what we have. There's more that I could say, but I'll leave that for the conversation. As far as the scientific evidence goes, I need to make a comment about how worldviews work. Worldviews are like a field of force, and this is from Quine, field of force whose boundary conditions are experience. A conflict with experience at the periphery occasions readjustments to the interior of the field. We have a conceptual scheme, and our empirical observations, which impinge on the edge of the field, cause a disturbance in the field, that is, our belief system. A conflict with experience at the periphery occasions adjustments to the interior of the field. But the total field is so underdetermined by its boundary conditions, experience, that there is much latitude of choice as to what statements to reevaluate in terms of, in light of any single contrary experience. If someone has a belief system and observes some empirical datum that is contrary to one of their beliefs, they adjust their belief system to account for it. But for a given empirical datum, there is no one statement in one's conceptual scheme that must be rejected because of the empirical data. An illustration would help to make this concrete. Imagine someone who believed in the Homeric gods were to believe in the statements, all gods are immortal and Apollo is a god. Imagine further that they made the empirical observation of Apollo getting killed in battle. What would this person conclude? Different people will give different answers. Some might reject all gods are immortal as false. Others might reject Apollo is a god as false. Notice that the conclusion that one draws depends on which belief one holds to more strongly. If someone holds very strongly to the belief that all gods are immortal, they will more readily conclude that Apollo is a god is false. If someone holds more strongly to the statement Apollo is a god, he will more readily conclude that the statement all gods are immortal is false. But notice that both of these conclusions are perfectly rational in terms of their own worldviews. Neither one can claim that the other is more or less rational. They simply account for empirical data differently. They both look at the empirical fact of Apollo dying on the battlefield, but draw different conclusions. One concludes then that because Apollo must be a god, then all gods are immortal. The other concludes that because all gods are immortal, Apollo must not actually be a god. Now, applying this to the scientific evidence. If you've adopted a worldview in which Scripture is infallible, then that commitment will determine how you interpret the evidence that purportedly proves that the Earth is millions of years old. Here are some examples. The evidence from alpha, beta, and gamma decay frequently give answers in orders of magnitude different from each other in terms of the age of the Earth. So even amongst the evidence that supposedly proves the Earth is that supposedly proves the universe is billions of years old, we get inconsistent answers. There's actually a formula in calculus that relates the radioactive decay to the mass of a radioactive substance. But the formula has two unknowns, the original mass and the amount of time the substance has been decaying. I believe Genesis to be a historical narrative, and as such I believe what it says about the age of the Earth. So for me, I can determine how much the original mass was, since I already know the time. People like Travis do the same procedure, but come at it from a different conceptual scheme, and thus will come away with a different conclusion. This is not because either of us is anti-scientific. It is because we have different conceptual schemes about science. There are direct lines of evidence of the Earth being thousands of years old, such as the helium diffusion and zircon crystals. Travis will have to ignore or reinterpret this data according to his own conceptual scheme, just as I reinterpret the radioactive decay evidence in terms of mine. This means that both sides have an explanation for all of the evidence for or against a young Earth, or old Earth, because of their different conceptual schemes. All of this evidence shows that when it comes to what the Bible says, it teaches 6-day creation and thus young Earth creation. Whatever other evidence we find outside of Scripture, such as radioisotope dating, fossils, or whatnot, must be interpreted within that context. We shouldn't be using general revelation to interpret Scripture, but Scripture to interpret general revelation.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Seth. So, yeah, with that, we'll throw it over to Travis, and then once Travis is done, I'll give a little explanation for the rest of the debate. It's going to be essentially open discussion, but like I said, we'll throw it over to Travis, and then we'll get into that, but let's listen to his opening statement, and I'll start at the time whenever you begin talking.
Okay, yeah, and it's interesting because there's actually like quite a lot that I agree with. But okay, so per the title of the debate, we're discussing evidence of what best explains reality and not biblical interpretation. However, to clarify my position, I hold to Michael Heiser's view of Genesis as an ancient Near Eastern polemic and John Walton's view of Genesis 1 and 2 as 6 24-hour days and a Sabbath rest where God orders functional rather than material creation. During the 7-day temple inauguration, God orders the function of the cosmos to serve as image bearers. We have to be careful to read ancient texts through the eyes of an ancient Hebrew and not our own modern Western scientific culture. It is evident that God is using functional roles in his description of the creation. For example, on day 4, the lights are assigned their function rather than material creation. We also see that the first few verses of Genesis are in the form of a polemic against the pagan deities and creation myths surrounding the Israelites at the time. And that if one were to interpret this materially, you would be forced with an interpretation of a 3-tier universe with a hard firmament, rakia, that held up the primordial waters and was supported by pillars. But rather what we see is the cosmos began functioning as sacred space. Someone whose only interest was the material cosmos would not have seen anything different happening. But with the completion of the 7 days, what is now happening has a newly defined reason and purpose decreed by God. It has a new identity. This new identification was associated with 7 24-hour days, just as the inauguration of the temple was. Genesis 1 is articulating a purpose through an mission statement, namely people living out their designated role as the image of God, and a vision statement, seeing the world around us as sacred space where God is living among his people and being in relationship with them. It is an accurate description of temple inauguration, of what temple inaugurations do in the ancient world and in biblical times. Temples were typically dedicated in a 7-day ceremony with God coming to rest in his temple once it was complete and his image was installed. Not only are sevens pervasively associated with the tabernacle and temple in the Old Testament, but humans are the authorized image in God's cosmic temple. God's rest on the Sabbath day could refer to his royal dwelling in and rule over the world he made, especially through human beings to whom he delegated authority over the earth, Genesis 1, 26-28. This view of God ordering the function of his cosmic temple does not compete with any scientific theory and in fact is even compatible with a young Earth. Now, for the age of the Earth, we turn to astrophysics and science. So first, I'm going to be defending idealism. Now, one of the leading theories in quantum gravity is that space-time is emergent from quantum information processing and quantum entanglement. In fact, quantum entanglement is essential for a successful theory of everything. The universe we now observe is emergent from information processing in an entangled state, which interestingly, quantum cognition states are the same quantum properties of thought and decision-making, which can be mapped in the human brain. Therefore, based upon the data, I would argue that according to quantum cognition and quantum decision theory, information processing in an entangled state is the product of mind. The universe emerges from information processing in an entangled state. Therefore, the universe emerges from a mind, and this mind is who we call God. Then studies in information theory, specifically pancomputationalism, state that every process in the universe can be reduced to interactions between subatomic particles that produce binary answers, like yes or no, here or there, up or down. This would mean that nature at its most fundamental level is the flipping of binary digits that run a specific program according to information processing. And of course, it's also my argument that a source of intelligence is required to process the information, showing that the universe is emergent from and is governed according to a mind. Then, once the universe goes classical at about 10 to the minus 35 seconds of the Big Bang, cosmic inflation occurs and the fundamental force breaks into four, which we know of as gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces. Just as matter and antimatter were created in a 1 in a billion asymmetry, which prevented the universe from devolving into pure radiation. The way in which the universe expanded after the Big Bang depended critically on how much total mass and energy the universe had, and also on the strength of the gravitational constant. Then, according to superstring theory, at about 10 to the minus 43 seconds of the Big Bang, the 10-dimensional expanding universe experienced a dimensional split. 6 dimensions ceased expanding, remaining quantized, and the other 4 became what we now know of as length, width, height, and time. For the first 363 million years, the universe contained only 5 elements: hydrogen, helium, and tiny traces of lithium, beryllium, and boron. Now, in addition to hydrogen, life requires carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and iron. But the Big Bang did not yield any of them. They were actually manufactured exclusively in the nuclear furnace of stars. These elements built up gradually. So basically, to have life chemistry, we must have the precise age of the universe that we have, and we can determine its age by the expansion rate. Now, one may be tempted to ask, why not just do it right away? And part of the answer is that given the laws and constants of physics God chose to create, it takes billions of years to fuse enough heavy elements in the nuclear furnace of giant stars to make life chemistry possible. Life could not happen any earlier in the universe than it did here on Earth. From there, we have the further evolution of the universe, with the physical constants like the ratio of the electron mass to the proton mass, the ratio of electromagnetic force constant to gravitational force constant, the entropy level, and so forth. In fact, it's worth mentioning that with the high level of entropy we have is actually essential for the formation of stars and planets. So we have to have the constant decay rate that we have. When we focus in closer, our Milky Way galaxy resides in a loose grouping of galaxies called the local group. The local group is located in the far outer ridge of the Virgo supercluster of galaxies. The funneling of much smaller dwarf galaxies into the core of the Milky Way galaxy itself is a process that has occurred over the past 10 billion years. In our solar system, if the timing of our solar system's last crossing of a spiral arm had occurred any earlier, humanity would now be too close, we would be facing like cosmic rays, a weaker climate, and a high probability of encountering a large molecular cloud. If the birth of our star planetary system had been any earlier, the quantity of heavy elements would be too low for rocky planets to form. Now we know the Earth is approximately 4.6 billion years old, and 4.5 billion years ago, there was a planetary collision at a 45-degree angle, which formed our moon and transformed our inhospitable atmosphere with one that was life conducive. Now, when we get to Earth science, I'll just briefly cover, some of the peer-reviewed scientific consensus backed by the consensus. So we know the early Earth was initially hot and inconducive to life. By the way, which is another way we can determine some of the age of the Earth's core is by the heat that's in it. Then we have the late heavy bombardment period, and after cooling, the Earth is globally oceanic and covered in an opaque atmosphere that light cannot penetrate through. Eventually, the atmosphere transforms from opaque to translucent. We have the formation of a stable water cycle occurring about 3.8 billion years ago. Dry ground begins to appear by plate tectonics and volcanism just after 3.8 billion years ago. Early plants and fungus begin evolving 750 million years ago. The Cambrian explosion occurs around 530 million years ago. Then we have the emergence of reptiles able to crawl on the land 360 million years ago. Mammals began evolving around 250 million years ago. Now, the exact time of the emergence of Homo sapiens has huge arrow bars on it. So roughly, we'll put humanity at about 150,000 years ago out of Africa, who then migrate to the ancient Persian Gulf oasis around 100,000 years ago. Then modern agriculture and domestication of animals begins occurring around 15,000 years ago, leading us to where we are now. Now, in addition, I would also mention philosophically, we have the universal applicability of mathematics. I mean, I find it fascinating that a mathematician sitting at his desk is able to work out equations which accurately describe phenomena occurring in the universe, which shows that our universe is intelligible, that we understand it, and that our science is correct, and it points to God. Now, this is just a brief overview, and I'll cover more, in more detail during the open conversation, and I'll go ahead and close it.
Awesome. Okay, yeah. So as we get into the open conversation here, we're going to be going for about 45 minutes or so, give or take a little bit. And it's the topic of the debate tonight, is what better explains reality? And each of the debaters has presented their opening statement with their worldview. So we're going to be obviously challenging both views. So I'm going to kind of keep us on track and stay less. I don't want just make sure we don't consistently argue one side or the other. It's fair. But like I said, it's an open conversation, so it's not going to be exactly timed or anything like that. But with that, I'll throw it over to you guys. And like I said, I'll step in where I need be, but hopefully not too much. But yeah, thank you for your opening statements, and we'll get this open conversation going.
Okay, so one thing that kind of comes to mind is I do hold to a literal Adam and Eve de novo created. I do hold to that.
Okay.
I hold to a very literal interpretation of Genesis myself. But my point is that it's describing functional creation rather than material creation. And what's interesting is it does not compete with any scientific theory. In fact, we can take the best theories of like astrophysics, earth science, quantum gravity, and they all correlate and they all harmonize and show evidence for God. So would you see a problem with that, Seth? That's.
There's still there.
Did you?
Okay.
Do I need to repeat the?
No, I heard you, Travis.
Okay.
Well, basically, I would just say, when you say, Genesis 1 describes the creation of function, not material reality, I would just say, why can't it be both?
Because we got to understand the text in a way that, like in ancient Hebrew, would have understood it, not apply our modern Western. And if you did, to really answer your question, if we did, like I said in my opening, we're forced with a 3-tier universe with a hard firmament with stars embedded in it, held up by pillars, and so it's obviously describing function. It's kind of like a combination that God met the people where they were at to communicate a theological message, not to impart advanced science to them.
Okay, that part is where I would disagree, because when it comes to literal or historical, I don't believe interpreting the Bible literally means it never uses metaphors. So, for example, in Acts 27:27, the literal Greek says that it's a missionary journey. They're in a ship and they're approaching an island. The Greek literally says that the island approached the ship. Okay. But that's obviously not true. It's being described phenomenologically. It's being described from that person's perspective. So if you or just again as an example that I gave from Isaiah, there are different places where Isaiah refers to the four corners of the earth, and it refers to the earth as a circle. Those are obviously metaphors. As far as the firmament in Genesis 1, rakia does not necessitate meaning like a thin metal sheet. It's used to describe stamping something out, or rolling something out. It's used in, I can get the exact references if you want, but it's used in 1 Samuel and Ezekiel to mean somebody's stamping their feet. There's no reference to a metal. There's no reference to metal there. And as far as like the pillars of the earth, okay, yes, the Psalms talk about the earth not being moved. The Psalms also have references to the earth being moved. So it's obviously not literally held up by pillars. There's no literal firmament, even if I take Genesis 1 as literal and historical.
Okay, now the reason I bring this up is because Hebrew scholars who specialize in this, like John Walton, Michael Heiser, and they look at the ancient Near Eastern like cultures that were surrounding the Israelites, and that was the common cosmology of the day. That was like widely accepted. A hard firmament, a three-tier universe, Sheol, like actually being underground. I mean, it's consistent with what the other cultures like. It was the science of the day, basically.
There are a couple issues with that. First of all, I think it's just an Ipsy-Dixit fallacy. I don't care how many scholars say it. I want to know what their arguments are. As far as Sheol goes,
now listen. I'm not appealing to the scholar. I'm appealing to the argument.
What is their argument?
That was the common cosmology of the day.
That doesn't prove it's the Bible.
And that the Bible it would be perfectly harmonious with it. But at the same time, I'm not saying that the Bible's teaching that. I'm saying if we want to apply it a strict material creation, then we're forced with that type of interpretation. And I think that's part of the evidence that it's speaking of ordering function. But this is kind of like getting into biblical interpretation and kind of away from like evidence of reality. But
well, what do you, when you use that phrase forced into that interpretation, which interpretation are you talking about?
Can you repeat that?
You mentioned being forced into a certain interpretation.
Right. Because if you want to interpret Genesis like literally and materially, you're stuck with things like the firmament, the held up primordial waters. That was the common understanding of the ancient Near East at the time. That was the common cosmology. Okay. I mean, I know we don't. It's hard to accept, but I think it's important to know.
No, again, just because it was the common cosmology of the day. I mean, you could just as easily argue, well, it was the common view of gods to have a pantheon in that day. Therefore, God isn't a trinity; it's a pantheon. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter what the surrounding cosmologies were. I want to know what cosmology of the Bible.
If the Bible is consistent with those cosmologies, it is.
Well, it's not, but it doesn't. What we're talking about is what interpretation of the Bible and what view of reality will actually account for the evidence, the scientific evidence and that kind of thing. Again, rakia does not mean metal firmament. It just means beating something out. It's often used to refer to like a sheet of metal. It's used that way, I believe, in Exodus when it's talking about the temple. A sheet of metal is beaten out. But if I take Genesis 1 literally, I am not forced to believe that there are four pillars. I'm not forced to believe in a flat earth. I'm not forced to believe in four pillars. I'm not forced to believe in a metal firmament. That is not implied by my view.
Well, then you're committing concordism and you're reading modern science into an ancient Near Eastern text. I'm
just talking about the Hebrew. The Hebrew word rakia does not mean there's a metal firmament. It's just not what it means.
And it was the common cosmology of the day.
Now, that still doesn't prove your point.
Okay, so so getting back to what I was saying,
doesn't mean that it's the Bible's cosmology.
The Bible seems consistent with it if we interpret it materially. And what I'm saying is that the Bible is God ordering function, not materialism.
Right, but you keep saying that, but
and by the way, that would also indicate that.
Okay, my point is that you've offered about three arguments to say that I'm forced into that cosmology, and I'm explaining to you why they're fallacious. First of all, it has to do with the lexical meaning of rakia. It does not mean metal firmament. Second, just because the surrounding cosmology was that doesn't imply that the Bible's cosmology is that. And third, it's an ipsy-dixy fallacy if you just say that the scholars believe it, so it's true. Those arguments don't establish that I am forced into that interpretation.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that that was the common cosmology of the day, and that the Bible could be read consistently with that.
When you read
Genesis,
of the day
it talks about the firmament that separates the water from the water. It could be very well could be consistent with that ancient Near Eastern cosmology.
No,
but I'm not arguing that the Bible
means.
is saying that. I'm arguing that the Bible is it has to do with God's cosmic temple. It's like temple theology, and that such a view does not compete with any modern scientific discovery whatsoever. And I can offer evidence for God based on modern science. I don't have to deny my modern science.
Okay.
And so,
we'll
to me, it seems the best explanation of reality.
Okay, well, we'll get to that in a second, but I would make the point, so just as an example, I don't think the Bible, I think heliocentrism is correct, but I don't think the Bible tells us whether geocentrism or heliocentrism is correct. So is geocentrism consistent with the Bible? I actually think it is, and that was the cosmology for 1,500 years in the modern era. I also think heliocentrism is consistent with it. I don't think it gives an answer either way. Now, if you want to say, well, the cosmology of the day is consistent with Scripture, okay, but you can claim that if you want, but Rakia, if you want to say that that's consistent with it, well, I'm talking about what Rakia means. Rakia does not mean firmament. It does not mean that. No, it doesn't. It can refer to, for example, a metal sheet being hammered out. But there's nothing about the word itself in that context that necessitates that it would mean that. As far as your scientific evidence, your argument from mind, where you talk about quantum entanglement implies God, I would have an objection to that argument where you said that that implies that there's a mind that controls the universe. I actually find David Hume's objection to that kind of argument really convincing. His couple of arguments, first of all, how does it prove the biblical God? Why couldn't it prove a polytheistic pantheon or something?
Okay, I need to interject. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. But when I'm arguing for idealism, it's just that a mind. You're right. It's not saying any specific God. It's just saying that like a first cause intelligent agency. It's not arguing for the biblical God. And I don't make the argument that it is.
Okay. Why couldn't it just imply that the universe is its own mind?
Because it's emergent from information processing, which is the product of mind. The universe emerges. It's not like pantheism, the universe is just all there is. But no, what this is saying is that like space, time, material is not fundamental. That mind is fundamental, and from mind emerges material.
How do you know that mind is what mind emerges, or everything else emerges from mind? How do you know that? Because studies in it kind of compares it with like studies in quantum cognition, that like the thought and mind processes can be described with quantum mechanics, like information processing in quantum entangled states are the same characteristics of mind that space-time under Sean Carroll's model emerges out of. So there's a correlation. And then when you get into pan-computationalism, we see that it's also governed at the subatomic level by information processing. So as an idealist, I'm saying that everything in the universe can be boiled down to information processing. Okay. My issue with that would be simply that the whole scientific process, I'm fine with the scientific process. Through the scientific process, we went from geocentrism to heliocentrism. So I'm not saying that science, I wouldn't want to say that science is infallible, but the fact that something changes from one theory to another, that doesn't mean that science doesn't tell us anything. My issue with the way you're arguing is that whole process of we're doing scientific research, that already presupposes an orderly universe. And I would say the only worldview that makes sense for that to emerge is the Christian worldview. So I would say you already have to presuppose that the Trinitarian God exists to even try to make that argument. You know what? I'm actually fine with that. I'm actually fine with starting with the Judeo-Christian faith, because that's just like general theism, and then I would get into like as a classical apologist, I would like make that argument that like a God exists, and then when we get into like the resurrection and the fine tuning, it kind of shapes into more of the Judeo-Christian faith. So I'm not really
I don't really have a problem with that.
Okay. I have one question. Or actually, I have
Sure.
two questions, and that might turn into other questions. If
Okay,
someone
then I
drives
have
it,
some questions for you.
okay, if someone drives his car from a Pacific Ocean beach due east for 6 hours, does that prove he used to be in the ocean?
No,
Okay. In that case, how do you know the Big Bang occurred?
because we have that's a good one. We have evidence that the galaxies are moving farther apart from each other by the redshift that was discovered by Edwin Hubble in 1925, and it makes future testable predictions. And every one of those future testable predictions is accurate. We can measure through the Hubble telescope and see the galaxies expanding farther apart, and it's even accelerating in velocity. And
Okay.
that's part of how we know how old the universe is by
Well, you
tracing and nothing is the velocity of light through the expansion.
Okay, but that
That's
goes back to
something
my
that's
question
like
about the car in the
we have.
Pacific Ocean. Your argument is the universe is expanding now, therefore it's all used to be a point. That that kind of argumentation you just said you didn't agree with the argument that I had about, if a man starts from a beach and goes due east, that proves he used to be in the ocean. Well, just because the universe is expanding, I mean, if there's evidence that it's expanding, okay, that's fine. That doesn't imply that it used to all be down into one point.
Yes, as a matter of fact, it does, because as I was saying, like the life chemistry, like for in the nuclear furnace of stars, we could not have life had it not.
Why can't
Under
God
the
make
laws
all
of
those?
physics that God created, not excuse me, under the
Okay.
laws of physics that God created, it would have to be in order for us to be here.
Why can't he
You
just
would have to
create those
special
conditions?
plea in order to get around.
Why can't he just create the necessary conditions ex nihilo?
Well, that's an ad hoc rescue because we have evidence that he didn't. We have evidence of how he did create.
Only because you're already presupposing the Big Bang occurred.
No, I'm presupposing that I have my cognitive faculties can address the science like scientists do. But now, can I ask you a few questions
Okay.
about your worldview? Okay, so you believe? I'm sorry.
No, I said sure. Go ahead.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I'm just gonna step in really quick, just
okay.
let everybody know in the chat and everything. There is a tiny bit of a delay, so they're definitely not speaking over each other like it seems a little bit. It's just a little bit of a delay. So yeah, just wanted to kind of get that because it definitely seems like you're like speaking over each other more than you definitely are. So yeah, we'll continue.
Okay. I'll try to be careful about that.
Yeah, you're definitely
Okay, yeah,
I just wanted to get that idea out there, make sure everybody realized what was happening.
Okay, so one question I have for you is, how do you have not only vegetation but actual fruit trees bearing fruit and everything with no solar luminosity? How does that possibly
work? God sustained it.
Can you? That's an ad hoc rescue. That's not explaining anything. It's like whenever
it's an implication from what the
whenever I can show you scientific evidence that your view is incoherent, all you do is say, well, God could do it. But we have evidence that God did it differently. And that's presupposing that you have the correct interpretation of Genesis. And that certainly hasn't been established.
I do.
That's debatable, but that's not this debate. But that is.
Well, it's part of the debate. Basically, I can give you yes or no answers to certain things. So
in other words, you have no explanation.
I may not be able to know. I mean, I can't explain how the virgin birth occurred. That doesn't mean I'm wrong.
Okay, so another question is, since we can't get an explanation on that, what about the massive amount of biodeposits and fossil fuels we have? I mean, we're talking like if you pack the earth with animals for 6,000 years, that alone does not explain the like 76 quadrillion tons of fossil fuels we have. How do you explain that from your worldview? The massive amount of biodeposits.
The flood is the best explanation for that, but I haven't researched that specifically. No. But again, that would go back to my point about, you hold more strongly to an old Earth. I hold more strongly to a young Earth. So I would argue there is, maybe there's some scientist who's given it a good explanation. I'm just not aware of it. But what it doesn't show is that I'm wrong. it does show that I can't necessarily explain everything in the detail that you want, but I can at least account for. Go ahead.
But no, I was going to say, like, I totally understand what you're saying, like with the flood and everything. But the problem is even granted that, like, even if I grant say, yeah, that's true, we don't, in that amount of time period, you're not going to generate that amount of biodeposits.
I guess
so that can't.
There were a lot more biodeposits prior to the flood than you think there were.
Okay, 6,000 years worth of animals does not get you the amount of fossil fuels and biodeposits we have.
Apparently it does.
That's okay. Well, I guess we'll leave that one unanswered as well. Do you have a question for me?
Well, here's the issue when it comes to giving an answer. I mean, I can give you answers in terms of my conceptual scheme. You can try to give answers in terms of your conceptual scheme. But there does come a point where neither of us are going to be able to answer the questions. I mean, neither of us is omniscient. If God says a virgin gave birth, then a virgin gave birth. Like, do I know the mechanism? Well, no, but that doesn't mean that I'm wrong just because I can't explain it. When it comes to some scientific discoveries, I mean, sure, there are going to be all sorts of explanations that I can offer, but there are some branches that specifically flood geology, I honestly haven't studied it very much. I've studied the text of Genesis enough, though, to know that it is, I think it's absolutely impossible to reasonably interpret the Old and New Testament as teaching anything except 6-day creationism and somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 10,000 year old Earth. Philip Morrow wrote a book called The Wonders of Bible Chronology, where he goes through, there's an unbroken chronology from Adam to the baptism of Christ from the Old in the Old and New Testaments.
Right.
And you might dispute a little bit, like maybe that they rounded things off. Okay, fine, maybe they rounded things off here and there, but the one thing you can't get is a universe that was created millions of years ago. The text absolutely cannot be properly interpreted that way. And so whatever evidence we find from alpha, beta, and gamma decay or astrophysics, the one thing it can't mean is, and again, it does go back to your presuppositions, like with the example I gave with the Pacific Ocean. I know the Pacific, where the shore of the Pacific Ocean is, and the guy went 6 hours east. I know he wasn't in the ocean. I know where the universe started. It was about 6,000 years ago. So even if the universe is expanding, for example, that doesn't prove it was always, it exploded from a single point. What that means is that God created a universe that was with various trajectories and velocities so that it is expanding. So it does come down to your worldview and your conceptual scheme, which means it does come down to how you interpret the Bible.
Well, okay, I would say that, reason and evidence are not quite as relative as you portray them to be. But going back to Adam and Eve, what's interesting is I've actually done a lot of study on this. In fact, Dr. Joshua Swamidas has a book on the genealogical Adam and Eve. So I can, now I'll put Adam and Eve at about 15,000 years ago because that's when we start really seeing the agriculture and everything. But I can grant Adam and Eve, de novo created 6,000 years ago, and we all descended from them. Like that's, I can grant you that, but that does not get you a young universe. Because like I said, with Genesis, Seth, you're in okay, so because Genesis is describing functional creationism. Now, I do believe in a literal Adam and Eve that were created out of the dust of the ground, probably from the rib or the side. I can grant all that. In fact, a lot of even I could even grant the genealogy. Now, I think it uses a base 60, but for the sake of conversation, I could grant that you have all that starting 6,000 years ago. But that doesn't get you a 6,000-year-old universe.
Well, the text, that's why I go to the text.
Under my interpretation of Genesis as functional rather than material, that explains everything and explains why we see what we see in science. We don't have to make like ad hoc appeals to, well, maybe it was just created with the appearance of age, and which wouldn't explain the biodeposits, and it's just a mess. Where this makes the best sense using like, I can appeal to quantum gravity, I can appeal to astrophysics, to the best biblical Hebrew scholarship of the day, a real Adam and Eve, and it just correlates and comes together. And my argument is that that is the best explanation of reality, whereas yours, we kind of hit these difficulties.
No, when it comes to, I mean, what you're calling ad hoc explanations, it's simply me interpreting a fact within my worldview. It's not an ad hoc explanation. It's a consistent explanation with my presuppositions. So when it comes to things
They
like,
can't explain anything.
well, I can't explain the virgin birth. That doesn't mean it's false. I mean, you can't explain the virgin birth either.
I wouldn't put because we're talking about with the virgin birth and like the resurrection of Christ. I know a lot of young Earth creationists will say, well, we can't explain that, but I would put that in a different category because we're actually dealing with God Himself.
And that's your ad
not
hoc
the material
explanation.
creation.
You're just making this ad hoc distinction.
No,
that doesn't count. But let me ask
so okay, well, in my ad hocness, I would not put God on equal grounds as the creation.
I'm not doing that either. But let me ask you this: Can you give me one single example of yam meaning when it's in that construction, not the prepositional construction? I've already conceded that. Can you give me one example of yam or its plural meaning anything except 24-hour day? Can you give me one example?
You're cutting out.
Sorry,
you cut out, bro.
Okay. Can you give me one example of yam meaning anything except a 24-hour day, except the prepositional construction? I've already conceded that.
I'm fine with 6 24-hour days and a 24-hour Sabbath rest.
Okay.
I think that's now. What?
How do you get millions of years out of that?
Because it's God ordering function. It's like I said in the beginning, it's God ordering function of His cosmic temple in 6 24-hour days, followed by a Sabbath day rest where He rules over His creation through His human delegates, us who are made in His image. So it is 6 24-hour days.
Is there anything in the text?
In 6 24-hour days. So I'm not appealing to day age, if that's what you think.
Okay. Is there anything?
That's a whole. Yeah, I'm not going with the day age.
Okay. Well, the problem is that the text doesn't say, and God created the functionality of light. It says He created the sun and the moon. He created plants. He created animals. He didn't just create functionality. So it seems like you're making the text say something that it just doesn't say.
No, what I'm doing is appealing to the ancient Near Eastern understanding of the way they viewed reality, and not importing my scientific, my 21st century science into it and trying to explain it materially. And like I said, and I do hold to this, I'm sorry you disagree, but with the cosmology of the ancient Near East, if you want a literal interpretation, you're going to get like a 3-tiered universe, the hard dome and stars embedded in the sky and so forth. And what I'm saying is that God is ordering function of His cosmic temple for 6 24-hour days, and then a Sabbath rest. So I can agree with you on the Yom is 24-hour days. I can agree with you on a literal Adam and Eve created out of the ground. I can agree with you on.
Can you give me an argument that would show that rakia must necessarily mean a hard metal firmament? And if that's true, how do you explain how that word is used?
It doesn't necessarily.
Okay. Well, then you're
okay. It doesn't necessarily
have to drop the argument that that a literal interpretation of Genesis would necessitate a hard dome firmament.
Okay. Given the cosmology of the day, that's how the term was used in the ancient Near East, in that region at that time. That I need to finish what I'm saying. That's how the term was used.
Can you give me an example of it being used that way outside the Bible?
I believe in the Egyptian creation myth.
The Egyptian creation myth was written
I don't know the specifics. What?
You're saying the Egyptian creation myth?
Yeah, the Babylonian creation myth. That was what I'm saying is that was the common thought of the day.
No, I'm
that the
about
Bible
the
could be read consistently with those creation myths.
I'm talking about rakia. You're saying, well, that was the cosmology of the day. That's how the term was used outside the Bible. Okay, give an example of how rakia was used outside the Bible. You cite an Egyptian myth, which you want to say that it was written in Hebrew. I'm asking about the meaning of rakia.
No, I didn't say it was written in Hebrew.
Okay, well, I asked for an example of rakia meaning firmament, a hard metal shell firmament
It can
outside
mean,
the Bible.
because listen, here's my argument. Rakia can mean a hard dome, or it can be soft. Okay, and the cosmology of the day surrounding the Israelites, it all meant hard. So it would be reasonable to infer that it was hard. But again, we're not really. The topic of the debate is the best explanation of reality. We started off saying this was not about Bible interpretation. It's like what explains reality.
I think, well, I go to the Bible to explain reality.
And so far, go ahead.
Okay, what I was going to say was, when it comes to importing 21st century science, I think that's exactly what you're doing. Because whenever I try to say, well, the Bible teaches a 6,000-year-old Earth, you keep saying, but modern science says, that the Bible can't actually say that. Well, I think that's the exact reverse of what we're supposed to be doing. There are things that modern science cannot tell us.
What I'm doing is using like the Hebrew scholarship. What I'm using is like the Hebrew scholarship of people like Michael Heiser and John Walton, who study this, and their argument is that the way the ancient Near Eastern people thought at the time was in terms of functionality over like material creation.
Right, but that isn't what the text of
and so that would not compete
with
any kind of scientific model. And like I've demonstrated, like my model is perfectly coherent with quantum theory, the latest in quantum gravity, with astrophysics, with earth science. And another thing you talk about, with science, I would say that the universal applicability of mathematics shows that our scientific understanding of the universe is correct. And in fact, when I pushed you on like, well, how do you get, fruit trees growing up with no solar luminosity? You have no answer. I mean, I think it's reasonable to conclude that my explanation is the best explanation of reality.
Is saying something is a miracle, is that not an explanation?
Saying something is a miracle? Yes, but we're talking about like creation.
Well, exactly. So, which means if it was a miracle, then telling you it was a miracle is the explanation. I can't give you an answer beyond that.
See, the problem with that. The problem with that is when we look at astrophysics and like, what happened like at 10 to the minus 35 seconds of the Big Bang when the fundamental force broke into four, and then there's a dimensional split, we can actually look and see how God did it, and it doesn't correlate with that. So, I mean, we can see like through the Hubble telescope how like the universe evolved. So, yeah, the argument holds.
Well, when I asked you about how we know the Big Bang even occurs, does the expansion of the universe by it? Let me ask you this: does the expansion of the universe? Will you admit that the expansion of the universe by itself does not prove the Big Bang? Correct.
It shows strong evidence, especially with the galaxies moving further and further apart, and then we can obviously trace it back to a singularity. That's basic astrophysics.
From the Pacific 6 hours due east, does that show strong evidence he used to be in the Pacific Ocean?
I'm going to leave your Pacific Ocean thing alone. That's like a question that I wasn't really following, kind of like to trip me up, I guess. Like if you could use another example.
Well, my point is this: if you have a rate of expansion, then all you have is a rate of expansion. It doesn't tell you about the initial conditions, but you keep trying to infer what the initial. Well, then the guy who is driving due east from the Pacific coast, that tells you there's strong evidence that he used to be swimming with beluga whales, I guess. That's obviously not the case. So you have to bring in something else.
Okay, so we have the expansion rate, we have the red shift, the fact that the galaxies are moving apart from one another. So I'm going to have to kick that back to you. And what is your evidence that there was not a Big Bang, that there was just an Earth, and then all of a sudden there were stars? Like you're going to need to offer some kind of explanation that justifies your position, like I've done.
Yeah, my explanation is
other than God did it. I mean, of course, happens. That's just like a rescue. Whenever you get caught scientifically wrong, you say, "It's a miracle, God did it."
I can't tell you anything more because it was a miracle.
In other words, you have no explanation. I'm offering explanation. You have no explanation. And when you get scientifically
you're offering a fallacious argument.
Retreat back to, well, God did it. I mean,
So,
come
Travis,
on, man. That's
I'm
very
offering,
intellectual.
Travis, I'm offering a miraculous explanation. You're offering a fallacious extrapolation from a rate expansion. So we both have our problems.
No, it's called modern science, my friend.
No,
it's called astrophysics. It's called Big Bang cosmology, and it shows evidence. It shows evidence of God.
But tell me, like, as far as
I'm fallacious in arguing for the Big Bang. That's like one of the most accepted theories in modern science that we have ample evidence for.
Well,
so I need you to show evidence that there was not a Big Bang.
Too.
Can you? I hold the process structuralism, which is a form of intelligent design. But before getting to that, let's go back to the Big Bang. What is your evidence that there was not a Big Bang? Since I showed evidence for, what is your evidence against? Because remember, you have to justify that you have the best explanation of reality, and it's really not going well like so far.
My evidence for it my evidence against it is that, first of all, I think there's a categorization error. There's a difference between philosophy and science. I was just reading actually a book that was Danny Faulkner's book, where he refutes all sorts of flat Earth claims. And one of the points he makes at the end is he makes a distinction between historical science and observational science. I can do experiments. I have the ability to do experiments right now that can verify whether the Earth is spherical or whether the electromagnetic laws hold. What I can't do is go back a million years and see if something is the case. That's historical science. That's an extrapolation.
Well, actually, we can't through the Hubble telescope and the velocity of light. We actually can.
How?
Through the Hubble, through like with the velocity of light and the expansion rate, we can actually view, like from say I think 300 something million years after the Big Bang, we can measure its expansion.
Right.
In fact, you can go on the NASA website.
Which is your conclusion, because you still continue to presuppose the Big Bang. The Big Bang isn't science; it's cosmology.
I presuppose the Big Bang. We have evidence for it. I mean, that's not subjective. We have observational evidence for it. Like I said, with the redshift, the fact that we can measure the galaxies are moving farther apart from each other, and it's accelerating in velocity. And in fact, that's the cosmological constant in dark energy.
And all of that proves the Big Bang only if you presuppose the Big Bang.
That shows evidence for the Big Bang. You can show no evidence to the contrary. In fact, all of your views, all of them have no scientific bearing whatsoever. Nothing. No, I mean, I think one of the worst criticisms is fruit trees growing fruit, with no solar luminosity. You've got quadrillion tons of biodeposits you can't account for. I mean, how can you reasonably say you have the best explanation of reality?
Because mine doesn't contradict the Bible.
Mine doesn't either. You see, you're presupposing, there's that word presupposing, that you have the correct biblical interpretation. And per Spartan theology, he wanted to make sure that we don't get locked into a Bible translation thing, and that we present evidence for reality. And then every time I show scientific evidence against your point, you just say, well,
Well, so there's some scientific topic. Okay, how do you explain the helium diffusion in zircon crystals then? That definitively points to a 6,000-year-old Earth.
I haven't studied it. I'm not going to address something I haven't studied. I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not biology. My main thing is astrophysics. If I don't know, it's like if
your model fails too.
Listen, if I push you on a scientific question, you're like, well, I haven't really studied that. Well, then, okay, cool. Let's move on. I don't know.
Well, why can't I just say, well, there you go. There's your ad hoc explanation. You were here to explain stuff, and you're not explaining. You're just saying, I don't know. I mean, there are any number of branches of science that people can study. I mean, I've studied some things in detail and other things not in so much detail. But so you can always game me like that. You can always find some branch of science that I haven't studied. I can find stuff that you haven't studied. Well, what we're talking about is the overall interpretation. Which one is best?
Okay, well, here's something that kind of differentiates it. There's a plausible explanation that would explain away yours and give evidence for mine. What I can do is I can actually personally research it, because it is an area I haven't studied, and I will actually look into this for you and let you know my conclusions.
Okay.
But but now listen, here's the difference. It's plausible either way. When you get to things like fruit trees growing fruit with no solar luminosity and like quadrillion tons of biodeposits, there is no other plausible explanation. So there's a huge difference in comparing.
Well, you're simply asserting that there can't be enough biomass there. You're not really giving evidence for
it. You could verify the amount of fossil fuels that we have through the biodeposits, yes, and it literally disproves that the Earth could even remotely be 6,000 years old.
How? What's your argument for that?
Because I've actually
asserting that it disproves it.
No, I'm not asserting. I've actually explained it. Okay, so that amount of animals, like it has to come from living things.
Yeah.
If you have, say, you pack the Earth full of animals for 6,000 years, that still would not even come close to the amount of biodeposits we have.
Well, how do you know
that? Peer-reviewed science.
Okay, what are their arguments for it?
The 76 quadrillion tons of biodeposits we have. And it takes hundreds of millions of years to get that amount of biodeposits.
Okay, what's the argument for saying that it had to have been hundreds of millions of years to get that much biodeposit?
By the sheer quantity and the process by where it breaks down in like limestone and coal, the way it breaks down and the amount that we have.
Okay, well, explain that process to me.
I've explained. What else do you want me to say?
You're saying, well, because of the processes, it couldn't have been that much. Okay, well, how do you know?
I'm going off peer-reviewed science.
So it's an ipsy-dixit fallacy then. You're just saying scientists.
No, it's called modern science. It's not an ipsy-dipsy fallacy. It's modern science.
Ipsy-dixit.
So you would actually have to, if you want to challenge modern science, you need to come up with a competing model that shows that they're wrong. Because I'm going with established science. So if you want to challenge established science, you have to show that they're wrong and offer a more plausible explanation for the data.
Okay, let me try this. See if this will go somewhere. One of the evidences that the moon is a disk is you can actually photograph light penetrating it.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know that's not true?
How do I know the moon is not a disk?
Yeah, people have photographed light specks penetrating the moon.
Well, the moon reflects light. It's not what I don't understand.
No, I mean a new moon, like at night.
I'm not following. Could you?
People have photographs of points of light penetrating the moon from the other side, and that proves to them that it's a disk instead of a sphere, instead of a solid sphere. How would you refute them?
Because they're looking at it from their point of reference. But when we go up, and another thing is like, okay, if you have, according to the laws of gravity, if you have something with that mass, gravity will form it into a sphere.
Yep.
The law of gravity disproves it.
No, I'm talking about the photograph.
Unless, of course, gravity is ad hoc too. I mean, do you at least agree with the current law of gravity?
Flat earthers disagree. I mean, I'm not a flat earther, but I just happen to have read a book on it. But one of the things that's interesting is that it's very easy for people who haven't looked into it to kind of catch them out. They can't explain why. So I've seen alleged photographs of people who they've photographed the moon, like a new moon, and points of light have penetrated it. There's also the fact that if you look at crepuscular rays, they show they don't come straight down through the clouds. They actually point to it. If you look at where the rate, as it were, the rate of expansion, if you look at where the rays converge, it's right above the clouds, which means the Earth is or the moon or the sun is only 3,000 miles away. That's what flat earthers believe. How do you know they're wrong?
The law of gravity.
Before you get started,
the law of gravity proves that
the law of gravity. If you just real quick, Ethan, if you have something like with that mass, the law of gravity will naturally form it into a sphere. That's how we know that
gravity isn't
not
true,
flat. That's how we know the moon is a sphere, not a disk. The law of gravity.
Okay, well then I can just reject the law of gravity then. How do you explain it?
Then your explanation of reality has gotten a whole lot worse than it already is.
Look, I'm not actually advocating flat earthism. I'm just pointing out
I
that
know.
if somebody's clever enough, they can give you scientific evidence that you can't explain. You keep referring to gravity. I'm not talking about gravity. I'm talking about the refraction of light.
Well, gravity
And you
would show
haven't
that the
offered
Earth,
an explanation of how that can work. There are also photographs of clouds being in front of and behind the sun. How do you explain that?
that's just from their point of reference and like
No.
reflections of light.
No, I have seen these. No, I can tell. I know what the explanation is. But Travis, I have seen photographs of clouds in front of and behind the moon, or photographed in front of and behind the sun. So apparently the sun
Okay,
is
so
in the
we
clouds.
know the distance. Listen, we know the distance of I don't know what the exact number is, but we know the distance of the Earth, of the moon from the Earth. We know that the law of gravity will take that amount of mass and form it into a sphere and everything. No, that's common astrophysics.
That doesn't even address remotely the issue of clouds being in front of and behind the sun. That is, you're not explaining it at all.
Yes, as a matter of fact, it does, because it explains. We know the moon. We know the distance that the moon is up. We know gravity forms it into a sphere.
Yep.
You know, you're talking about pictures and reflections of light. That has no explanatory power when we know the laws of physics.
Right, and you keep talking about gravity, and you're not talking about the reflection of light from the sun. I've seen photographs of clouds in front of the sun and behind. I want an explanation for that, not gravity.
I'm just gonna jump in. We just got a few more minutes.
I don't. That has nothing to do with.
Yeah, we just have a few more minutes left in the.
That has nothing to do with anything.
Open discussion.
That has no.
So I'm just gonna talk over Travis. He's got a little bit of a delay.
Completely a red herring.
But yeah, we just have a few more minutes in the Q&A or the open discussion. So if we could kind of, as we wrap up, I'm thinking what we could do is give both Seth a few minutes to kind of cross-examine and get his like last few points out. If you have some last-minute questions, and then we'll let Travis do the same thing. So if you guys could take maybe a couple minutes each and just kind of wrap up your questions for the other person, and then I'll give you guys a minute to like wrap up your own. But like give a bit of a closing if you want before Q&A. But if we could just like kind of, we'll give Seth the floor right here to kind of give his last few questions for Travis, and then we'll throw it over to Travis. But if that works.
Okay. Let's see. I had a question. I'm kind of blanking on it, so maybe we could have.
Yeah, you're good. First. We can definitely. Okay. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, and it's no problem. It's just we both agree that God did it. It's just a question of how He went about doing it. So it's not a big deal. But how would you address the fact that life chemistry was not initiated at the Big Bang? Like it had to build up in the nuclear furnace of stars, and that's a process that takes billions of years. How would you explain that? Or would you just simply reject it? I mean, it's fine. Like, do you just reject that aspect of modern science, or do you have a better explanation?
That presupposes the Big Bang, so I would just say that isn't what happened.
Oh, no Big Bang, no nuclear. Okay, no.
Nope.
Well, all right, there we go. But there's no evidence against the Big Bang, or against. Let me put it this way: you have no evidence that that's not how like life chemistry came about.
No, I have evidence that isn't what happened. I mean, I gave you all sorts of biblical evidence. There's scientific evidence. The apparently contradictory scientific evidence, I think, does have an explanation. So.
Okay, so, well, I mean, if I keep asking these questions, because it comes to a point, here's what I've kind of noticed in the debate. There's certain things that, I haven't studied and I can't really give an answer to. Then there's other things that would like show young Earth creation couldn't even plausibly be true. Like to go back again to the example of like vegetation and fruit trees with no solar luminosity, and an answer can't really be given to explain the reality. So I think we're kind of at a stalemate there, Ethan.
Okay, I can jump in with my questions.
Sure. But I mean, because like everything that I would throw out there, it's like, well, I don't know, God did it. It's a miracle. I mean, so that doesn't really, I don't really know how to conversate with that.
Yeah, so we can throw it over to Seth for his last few questions here, and then we'll get the closing statement.
Travis, if I can find it, sorry. If I can find an astrophysics question that stumps you, does that prove that your entire theory is wrong?
Of course not.
Right. So if you ask me a question
I'm not
about
even that guy. I
astrophysics,
mean, I'm a student myself. I don't have any authority.
right, so that means that if you can stump me on certain questions of astrophysics, which you can, there are some aspects of astrophysics that I haven't studied. If you can stump me on those, that doesn't prove I'm wrong, correct? Is that correct?
Correct. And I wasn't like, that's kind of like what I said that, like, I'm not going to push you on something. Like if you're like, well, I don't know how that works, that's fine. But what I was saying is that argues powerfully against the earth being young, especially in the way that it's laid out. Like if you take a literal Genesis account, like, the earth, the earth, like just being still with no stars or moon or sun or anything. It's just contrary to everything we know in science.
Okay. Can you give me an explanation for the moon being a disk, and for crepuscular rays, and for shoot, what was the other thing I said?
Can I give you an explanation for the moon being a disk?
Yeah. Can you give me an explanation that you think refutes the moon being a disk, refutes crepuscular rays, and does so without referencing gravity?
Yeah, I think the last one you were trying to think of was the clouds or whatever with the sun.
Oh, the clouds, yeah. So crepuscular rays, clouds in front of and behind the sun, and the moon being a disk because people have photographs of light penetrating it. Can you explain why you think those are wrong without referencing gravity?
Without referencing gravity, okay.
Yep.
The picture would be like, the way the light's projected from that certain point of reference. But, if I did appeal to, we know that gravity attracts mass at certain amounts and so forth. So that's kind of a hard question to say you can't appeal to gravity.
No. Well, okay, point of reference. What do you mean? How does the point of reference explain it?
The point of reference of the photo being taken.
Okay, I'll give you.
If I'm misunderstanding, please do feel free to elaborate. Because
I'll give you the crepuscular rays one, but explain the lunar disk and clouds in front of and behind the sun without using gravity.
That's a loaded question to not be able to use gravity. That's like saying don't use the laws of physics to explain physics.
Flat earthers reject gravity.
Well, then, if somebody is willing to deny the very core tenets, I mean, we can prove gravity. You can pick something up and drop it. There's the law of gravity. I mean, that's a loaded question. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. We know gravity exists. We know that it attracts mass. This is common knowledge of physics.
Okay, so clouds in front of the sun and behind the sun. Okay, fine. Go ahead and use gravity to explain it. How can you explain that specific light phenomenon? How do you explain it?
In like scientific, in like specific detail, I can't explain it. What I'm saying is that
I guess flat earthism is true because I just stumped you.
No, but see, there's a plausible explanation, and like when I appeal to
and you're not giving one.
Listen, well, yeah, kind of, because we know that the Earth, the moon is a certain distance from the Earth. We know the laws of gravity and how it attracts mass and how it forms it into a sphere. We know all this. We have evidence for it. We have observational evidence for it. So that's a complete red herring. I mean, that does nothing.
That explain?
That does nothing. In other words, how is this arguing for your model of the 6,000-year-old Earth being the best model of reality? It doesn't. See, I can account for all of physics. I can account for quantum gravity. I can account for all of this, even the interpretation of Genesis, even a little Adam and Eve, who we all are genealogically related to. I can explain it all. Whereas your explanation is a books. I mean, it's just
you say all that, but you can't even explain
to the laws of physics. It's incoherent.
Okay, you're saying all that, and you can't even tell me why we observe clouds in front of the sun and behind the sun. You said it. Well, it's gravity. Okay.
Well, okay.
I'm talking about light. Light. Explain it in terms of the physics of light.
And I'm saying, like, if you take a picture and like it's from one observational aspect.
Okay. Well, why is it that we observe clouds behind it?
From your current point of reference, it has that appearance.
Why? How? Why do clouds appear to be behind the sun?
Perhaps you could tell me.
I think for the fun of it, I won't. Maybe I'll message you later. But here's the point I'm making with
Well,
that.
in all honesty, I'm not really sure where that was going, but I don't really.
Here's the reason I was going. Here's where I was going with that argument. We were talking about which perspective fully explains all of reality. Then, and there are aspects of astrophysics that you've obviously studied a lot more than me. That doesn't invalidate my perspective, but you are arguing as if it did. I can find. Hold on. We can both stump each other with scientific questions because we've studied different aspects of different branches of science. So, but that isn't what the issue is. The issue is not who isn't omniscient. Well, I'm not omniscient. I can't explain everything. You're not omniscient. You can't explain everything. You don't know every branch of science. I don't know every branch of science. But which perspective is actually coherent? And as a Christian, I believe it has to be coherent with the Bible. And you were bringing up things
I do too.
And you were bringing up things about the text of Scripture that are absolutely not compatible with what you were saying. And so I was just making the point through that, rabbit trail about flat Earth that, well, if me stumping you on one scientific question means my whole perspective is wrong, or even a couple of questions, that's not the question at issue. The question is explanatory theory.
So I need to address that. That's a really important point you bring up, and I understand the point. But see, here's the thing: there is a reasonable, plausible explanation that I can give. I just don't know it. But when we get to something like fruit trees and vegetation with no solar luminosity, there is no plausible explanation. So there's a difference. It's not just the stuff you don't know how it happened. It could, under the laws of physics that God created, it could not happen. So there's a difference between the examples.
No, it couldn't happen. Well, virgin births can't happen either, according to the laws of physics. There has to be a miracle for something like that to happen. So fruit trees can't come out of fruit trees cannot just sprout into existence.
They cannot grow and produce fruit without solar luminosity.
Yeah.
What?
Right. Yeah. Trees can't grow without solar luminosity, just like women can't have babies without a man.
Right. So again, that's you're appealing to God in the same way that you're appealing to fruit trees, and I'm saying that's totally different. And actually, because listen. Do
you think the creation wasn't miraculous?
No, I need to finish what I was saying. God himself would transcend the universe with its 10 plus dimensions. So if he transcends the laws of physics, he can easily accomplish a virgin birth without breaking the laws of physics. But when you get to like fruit trees growing in vegetation, and you'll notice the text says, let the earth bring forth. So it's like a natural process, and yet there's no solar luminosity. It's scientifically incoherent.
Right. It's an accelerated.
And it's different. It's different than just simply. It's different than just simply. Well, I don't know how it could work. It could not work.
Let me register this as a complaint. I think saying that God has 10 plus dimensions is your ad hoc explanation. So
no, he would. Well, no. Okay. Where the reason I say that is according to superstring theory, we need those dimensions to correlate general relativity with quantum mechanics. Okay. So, and if God created the universe, then he would naturally transcend the universe with its 10 plus dimensions. He could, who knows? But I'm saying that's just like a physical a crude example, if you will. But he could easily do that within the laws of physics without breaking the laws of physics because he's multidimensional. That's not the same instance as the earth bringing forth fruit trees with no solar luminosity.
So miracles don't exist at all then?
Yeah.
A biodeposit.
And with that, I think we're kind of like at a little bit of an impasse here for sure.
Okay,
so
that's fair enough.
Yeah, if you guys want to just give or maybe we could just go into Q&A. I think we kind of hit a little bit of a wall there, so I think Q&A will kind of help, like maybe spur on some good stuff.
I didn't prepare a closing statement anyway.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, we got some good questions from the chat, so I appreciate everybody. Complete Sinner's Guide. I haven't seen you around before, but thank you for coming by. You left some good ones. So
okay.
Yeah, we got questions for both, so I'll kind of try and go like each, not too many for one in a row for sure. But the first one is going to be for Travis. This was a later one that the Complete Sinner's Guide asked, but I thought this was pretty good to start it off with. So he said, is there any scientific evidence for a young Earth? So is there anything you would accept that points to a young Earth? Or do you think there's no evidence? Or how do you go about that?
There's one thing I think that's interesting that I think does have an explanation, but I don't know it, is like, the soft tissue in dinosaurs that they found. That's kind of like, that's one of those things that's like, whoa, let's look into this. What's that all about? So, I mean, I'm willing to admit that, if things point one way, to be scientifically honest. Now, I do think there is an explanation, but it's kind of one of those things that makes you think, what's up with this? And like I said in the beginning, if someone does hold to, said that interpretation of Genesis as being foundational to the faith, then I'm not really trying to argue against you. What I'm doing is presenting my model where science and faith are not in conflict with one another, but they harmonize. So I'm not trying to just specifically attack young Earth creationism as much as I'm trying to show a coherent view of Christianity with science.
No, I think that's fair, and I don't think it's an article. I think it can create problems and go sideways and go bad. Your perspective, but if somebody says, "Well, I'm old Earth and I'm Christian," I fully accept that. That's fine. I don't doubt the sincerity of their faith if they do that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, the reason why I think it is dangerous and potentially bad is because it almost always plays into there's kind of a foundational problem that I have where we just say, oh, we have to make the Bible amenable to modern science. Well, once you take that goes all sorts of places, because I have modern scientists, modern biologists today who say that there is no difference between men and women. So I do have a concern about people who want to adjust what the Bible says and make it compatible with it. I have more. I don't think that faith and science are two distinct fields. I think the relationship between them is more like science has its faith commitments, no matter what, and faith has scientific implications. So I don't think it's one or the other. And if you
right,
start
and Seth,
trying to compromise,
let me just well, let's let him finish the answer or whatever, and then you can give it a little bit.
And as soon as you try to bring in presuppositions from what I think is a conflicting faith, that may not create a problem for Travis, but as that begins to create problems. It's kind of like how leaven eventually goes through the whole loaf.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, do you want to say one last little piece for that question, Travis? I don't know if you had something to say.
Yeah. I just wanted to kind of address Seth and what my view is. I don't you have kind of like the Hugh Ross concordism where they read modern science into the text, but I would say that the ancient Hebrews would have been totally ignorant to any kind of modern science. So I'm not making that argument. What my argument is that God is ordering functional creation rather than material, and that it wouldn't compete, like science would be something totally different than in other words, they wouldn't compete at all. Just to kind of clarify.
Okay, yeah. So the next question is going to be for you, Travis. So
because there's so many versions of Old Earth.
Okay, yeah. And like I said, the next question is for you. It was from, I'm not sure, I had lost the track of who exactly all these were from, but it says, since science is always changing, what makes you think the theories you're discussing now won't change as well?
They very well could. That's one thing in science. And see, my argument is I'm not reading concordism into the Bible. I'm saying that the two are separate, that Genesis is not even addressing modern science. So now, could the Big Bang possibly be disproven? I think it's unlikely, but sure, it could be. With science, you have to hold it like with a loose grip. That's just part of science. Yeah.
Okay, nice.
Like,
Yeah.
look at the discovery of quantum mechanics and how that changed everything. So yeah, sure.
Okay, yeah, and like I said, that one's really just for
And
Travis.
I would say it is good to keep.
You can, you
okay.
can give your like a few sentences. That's fine. Yeah, it just wasn't necessarily a question for you, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just going to say, just to kind of tag off of that, I think it's good to keep that in mind, because one of the things that came up in our debate is the fact that, and Travis would say, well, Seth, the fact that you can't explain, it was almost like Travis was saying, because I explain this fact differently in my perspective, that proves you wrong. Well, no, like the evidence with Big Bang expansion rate. It's like, no, I explain it differently. And the fact
we have observational evidence.
Nobody.
We can observe the galaxy.
Bang.
We have evidence. So yeah.
Well, nobody.
That's science.
We can observe it expanding now. We don't know where
we can observe evidence that there was a Big Bang.
Well, again, that just goes back to I think he really is presupposing Big Bang cosmology and of course he brings.
No, I'm presupposing looking at observing the galaxies expanding and the red shift. There's no presuppositions involved. That's like observation.
Right, and it's observation interpreted from a.
It's kind of hard to presuppose your way out of that much evidence. You can work at it, but it's really hard to presuppose your way out of the Big Bang.
Well, that's because you always you always interpret evidence in terms of presupposition. So every fact.
Yeah, galaxies expanding apart from one another is consistent with Big Bang cosmology. If you want to call that a presupposition, go for it.
Okay. Well, yeah. I think that question was definitely well answered. That was a good one. Thank you. That was from the Complete Sinner's Guide as well. He asked some really good ones for Travis, for sure. It was nice to have him in here because we had a few people with questions for Seth, for sure. So it was nice to get both sides. So that one was for Travis. Let me pull up one for Seth. There were a few regarding your Hebrew that you were citing. And I think one of them right here, I'll say, does Seth read ancient/biblical or modern Hebrew fluently? He seems to be resting a lot on how he knows what certain words mean and how they function. And if you could kind of go into that, there was a few that kind of related to this, so I might chime in and like ask you to expand on a couple points. But they're more just like where you're getting your necessarily like how fluent are you in Hebrew and where you're kind of getting these ideas from with the Hebrew you were citing.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I'm not fluent in Hebrew. The stuff about Rakia I got from Danny Faulkner, who's an astrophysicist, and he deals with the Hebrew in Genesis 1. The stuff about Yom I got from Kenneth Gentry in his book, As It Is Written.
And then, Laura kind of followed that up with, do you think literature that is contemporary with the Hebrew Bible is useful for interpreting it? So I guess that's kind of where you guys were talking about like other uses of these words outside the Bible and stuff like that.
Right. The cosmology of the day, using it a certain way, how would that relate to the Bible? Is that the question?
Yeah, more about the Hebrew, but like how the contemporary other texts could be used.
Well, here's my answer to that. I wouldn't say that it's never useful. So, for example, when in the debates about masculinity and femininity, Wayne Grudem has a lengthy and extremely boring article on the Greek word kephale, which means head. And one of the things that he did to establish the semantic range is he looks at how the word kephale was used around the time the New Testament was written. And the evidence from Scripture and outside Scripture points to it. Basically, it doesn't mean origin, it means head, like, this thing. So it can be useful in determining semantic range, but it's not necessarily determinative, because sometimes authors use terms in sometimes biblical authors use neologisms. For example, when Paul talks about in 2 Timothy 3:16, he talks about the Bible is God-breathed. That's a neologism. The word theanustos is not used in any contemporary literature or any previous literature. It's used later because Paul used it, so people started using it. So biblical authors use neologisms. Sometimes they use a narrow semantic range for some of the words they use. So it can be helpful. The one thing that will not ever be a valid argument is claiming the Bible has a certain cosmology because people around them had a certain cosmology. That's a completely fallacious argument and doesn't tell us anything about what Moses's cosmology was.
Okay, yeah, I don't know if you want to give like one or two. Well, we can move on. We got a question for Travis next, and I think this one is a good one that Seth was kind of trying to bring up, and I think maybe we could retouch it too. Is like, can God break the laws of physics? So, like I said, I think Seth was kind of bringing this up, and it was asked in chat, like things regarding like the incarnation, the virgin birth, and resurrection. Like obviously these are like breaking the law, so why can't, I guess, the same thing be said about creation?
That is a very good question. Very good question. And here's the thing. See, God created the laws of physics, and he's transcendent of the laws of physics. And if you're transcendent, you're not going to break the laws of physics. Now, I don't want to take too much time, but think of like, say you have a figure on a one-dimensional sheet of paper. Then me, from 3 dimensions, I can poke a finger through that one-dimensional sheet and interact with them and it wouldn't be breaking their laws of physics. I would transcend their laws of physics. So in the same way, God transcends the laws of physics. So when he does something, it's not breaking the laws of physics. It's actually overriding. It's not breaking. That's an ontological difference.
Okay.
Is that clear?
No, I think that's pretty clear. I think Seth might have like a little follow-up, and that's fine, because I think this was like a bit of a contention in the debate. I don't know if it got fully cleared up. So yeah, you can give a few.
Well, one thing, John Frame actually has a really good article on this, and he argues that, again, no, God doesn't, breaking the laws of physics would be like God contradicting himself. So what God does do is he does things providentially that frequently go against our expectations. So if we establish the law of gravity or whatever, God stopping the sun in Joshua 10 doesn't break the laws of physics. It simply goes against what we normally expect from his normal providential rule of creation. And I would say that's what happened in Genesis 1. Does it normally happen that a tree can grow in a matter of seconds and without solar luminosity? No, that's not what normally what happens. But what God did instead was just go against our normal expectations.
Yeah, but he said, let the earth bring forth.
Yeah, he used a means. He used
like a natural. He referred to it as a natural process, not
the
divine. He said, "Let the earth bring forth."
No, he told you where it was going to come from. It wasn't a natural process. Just like, it wouldn't be wrong to people to say
the ground producing vegetation and trees is not a natural process.
No, in the same way that you could say. Okay, in the same way that you could say that, let the earth bring forth a tree, well, let the virgin bring forth a child. That doesn't mean that the child, in some kind of ultimate sense, originated from the woman. No, it originated from God. The tree didn't.
Yeah, but God transcends the laws of physics. The natural creation does not. The natural creation is the laws of physics. Different category. It's a category.
No, they're the same thing. The laws of physics would dictate that a woman, a virgin, cannot give birth, and the laws of physics would dictate that a tree cannot grow without solar luminosity, and it can't grow in a matter of seconds. It's the same thing.
Right, but God transcends. See, we're talking about the virgin birth. That's Jesus, who would transcend the laws of physics, whereas the earth bringing forth vegetation and fruit trees bearing fruit without solar, there's no transcendence going on there. That's a natural process that cannot occur because there's no solar luminosity. I mean, we have to do an ad hoc rescue to solve the chat. But
it's a natural process in the sense the sun going across the sky is a natural process, but God stopped that too.
Yeah, I think we kind of beat that one as much as we can, I think.
No, I actually honestly would be interested in what Travis's answer would be to that particular miracle.
What miracle is that?
Joshua 10.
Oh, the sun?
That seems to be, to me, the same thing as the tree.
No, I see that as being like metaphoric. And to be honest, I haven't really studied that aspect of the Old Testament, but it kind of seems like metaphoric. Like, you know, I would have to actually look into that to give a concrete
All
answer.
right. Well, sounds like an ad hoc explanation to me, but we can move on.
No, it sounds like I haven't really studied it, so I can't give a concrete answer because I haven't studied that part of like with the. But I know there's several different interpretations.
Yeah. So
I'm not taking a position on either one. I would like actually, I like to look into things for myself and then go through it. So.
yeah, and
Okay,
yeah,
well, what about the floating axe head then?
The what?
The floating axe head.
The floating axe head?
Yeah, that miracle. What about that one?
I'm not aware of the floating axe head.
It's in, I think it's First Kings. I think I want to say Elijah does that miracle. He puts an axe head in a pool of water and it floats.
See, I'm not familiar. Now, what I am familiar with is like Elijah being taken up with a whirlwind, and that's like God taking I guess to heaven or whatever so I'm aware that God can transcend the laws of physics and everything, but I'm saying that doesn't correlate to the thing about the fruit trees. It's a different category.
Why would it be in a different category?
Because we're talking about God, the ontology of God, whereas Genesis is specifically laying out a natural process. Let the earth sprout vegetation and fruit-bearing trees and everything. And there's no sun, there's no moon, there's no stars. We know scientifically that's impossible. And see, because you can't, it's not just that you can't explain it or I've stumped you. It's impossible. According to the laws of physics that God made, it's impossible for that to happen.
It's also
not just a
impossible
question
for a
of stumping
chariot to
something.
go up into
No,
the sky.
it's literally
according to
impossible.
yeah,
It cannot happen.
yeah.
It's
With
also
that,
literally impossible for a chariot to go up into the sky. That's against the laws of physics too.
yeah, I think we're kind of like reach an impasse on this one for sure. And I totally I think this is a really good point in the debate though, for sure. It's like, I mean, because I see where Seth's coming from for sure. Like, I mean, a virgin birth is impossible according to the laws of physics. So why can't a tree just get its light from wherever, I mean, I think that's a good point. I don't want to beat this too much because I think we've gone over this one enough or whatever. So if we can, I think we're better off just moving on. I think we have just a couple more, if that's okay. And this one was for Seth. It says, why does Seth think the Bible has a cosmology? What account of the Bible is he presupposing? If you need me to kind of clear that up a little bit, but I think that makes sense.
Yeah, it would depend on what you mean by cosmology, because there's a technical difference between cosmology and cosmogony, and I don't have that memorized. I think I'd have to look that up in a dictionary. I think technically the Bible doesn't have a cosmology, but it has a cosmogony, meaning like an origin of the cosmos. I believe that's the meaning. Don't quote me on that. If by cosmology you mean heliocentrism versus geocentrism, if that's what you mean, then no, I don't think the Bible has a cosmology.
Okay, and then
But if by cosmology you mean nothing existed and then there was chaos and then something burped out of the chaos that happens in Hesiod's theogony. That's a different. The Bible is different than that.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. And then I think this might be the last question. This one's for Travis. It says, can God create biodeposits ex nihilo? So I think this question is good too, and it kind of is a little more broad than how do we know that just these things that you're citing, like biodeposits and other things, weren't just created with the appearance of age? I think is kind of what this question's getting at.
You can make certain arguments for the appearance of age, but my argument with the biodeposits is because it comes from living animals. So if he created with the appearance of age, that would be like creating the appearance of dead animals. If you want to call that logically coherent, go for it.
Yeah, I don't know if Seth wants to give a few sentences there or not, or just kind of leave it at that.
Basically, yeah, I don't have a problem with God creating the appearance of age. I mean, Adam was created as a male human, which, some people would say, oh, well, that's a lie. He doesn't actually, 30 years old or whatever. Well, okay. Then if you don't have a problem with Adam being created to be an adult, then I don't think you can have any objection beforehand with biodeposits.
Well, biodeposits are from dead animals. So he would have to create the appearance of dead animals. And if you want to call that logically consistent, I won't even argue with you. Go for it. Cool.
The question is, is it possible for God to do that? The basis for saying that God can't create the appearance of age the usual objection is, well, that's God lying. Well, if you don't have an objection to God creating Adam as an adult with the appearance of age, then you can no longer on that basis object to biodeposits or trees.
Yes, because we're talking about dead animals.
Yeah, that's a lot of age then.
Okay, and then there is one more question for both of you, and
okay.
We'll see. It was from JB. I mean, it definitely. We'll see. So if God has ultimate knowledge that we don't, aren't all arguments using His inspired word just an argument from authority? Yeah, I'm not quite sure. Yeah. I think it's pretty safe to say sure. I guess. Yeah.
Arguments from authority are not always invalid.
Yeah, it's not necessarily a fallacy to use authority. The argument from authority fallacy is when you use someone who's not an authority or a bad authority or whatnot. So, yeah.
Right. So if you're an expert in the field of study, it's okay to appeal to them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, yeah, you can definitely appeal to people who are authorities. That's not necessarily.
But I couldn't say, like, for example, Francis Collins is a brilliant scientist and he's a Christian. Therefore, Christianity is true. Like,
exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's appeal to authority. But, I mean, yeah, if we're using scripture, I mean, as Christians, I think it's pretty easy to agree that God's not going to be wrong. So that would be a pretty good authority if we know what He's trying to say. So, yeah. Well, cool. I think we reached the end of our questions. I mean, we definitely hit on some good topics in the debate. I appreciate you guys taking time and doing this. I hope people enjoyed the conversation. I don't know if you guys have any very last words before we head out, but if not,
I think we pretty much.
I just wanted to. Oh, I'm sorry. There's a line.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say that Seth and I are brothers in Christ. We both agree that God created. And the thing is, we have like some disagreement on how He went about doing it. Again, it's whatever position that a Christian comes to. What's important is having Christ, accepting Christ and following Christ and receiving the Holy Spirit. That's what it really means to be a Christian. And it's important to know that these are like secondary issues because we both believe in God. We both accept the Christian worldview. We just have a disagreement on like how God went about doing it. So, and these are like important in-house discussions to have. I'm pretty happy with it.
Cool.
Yeah,
Sounds
for sure. So like I said, thanks everybody for watching, and God bless. We're going to end the stream here.